recall last week we were looking at the kind of tearful goodbye between David and Jonathan, that close bond of friendship that Jonathan, as far as Jonathan knew, was kind of breaking up because Saul, his father, wanted David dead. And why do we know that he wanted David dead? Well, he tried 3 times to get him. So that's going to be your hint, right? If you ever want to know if somebody wants to kill you, if they try to kill you multiple times, that's a good indication they want to kill you. Saul does this 3 different times. At David throws a throwing spear, it's called a javelin. We actually still have Olympic competitions that are javelin throws. This is actually meant to be a weapon of war. It's now become a sport. But in the ancient world, there were talented people who their primary weapon was a javelin. They were a melee group of soldiers. They would throw their spears and then they would charge with their short swords. And so Saul 3 times has tried to kill David with a javelin. He's also tried to kill his son Jonathan with a javelin. That'll make you a little bit fearful. I don't know if anybody in this room has ever had that close of a brush with death, that they were fearful of being around somebody else or being around an experience. Glenn, you were a pilot. I'm sure you have more than a couple little scary moments. I've never been a pilot. I'm scared to death of getting in one of those planes. I think I have a near-death experience every time I enter an airline. But anyway, victory over fear. But we're talking about fear this morning. Nikita Khrushchev, a figure from history, took over for the Communist Party in Russia in the 1960s, and he was the head of the Soviet Union in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis of John F. Kennedy's tenure in the United States. And once he was addressing the Politburo and his Communist Party, and he was lamenting the mistakes of the past and the previous tenure with Joseph Stalin and the true monster that Joseph Stalin was. In fact, if you guys are a little bit curious about your history, Joseph Stalin, every bit of a monster as Adolf Hitler and others. And Joseph Stalin doesn't quite get the monster designation that others get in history, but Stalin made a wreck of his country. Millions of peasants died simply because Joseph Stalin was a monstrous, paranoid person. By the way, that was thrown in my face one time that he was a seminarian, Joseph Stalin was. Because his mom wanted him to be a priest. So he went to seminary. Somebody said, see, all the mistakes of the world come with those religious types. And I said, well, you need to check the rest of that story because Joseph Stalin, once his mom died, dropped out of seminary and declared himself an atheist. So be careful what evidence you throw in people's faces. Sounds like atheism is a bit of a problem, but I digress. Fear. Nikita Khrushchev is addressing the Communist Party. He's lamenting the mistakes of Joseph Stalin, the monstrous nature of Joseph Stalin. And then he hears in the back of the room, why didn't you stop him? Khrushchev was a young politician at the time. The situation, with Joseph Stalin, why didn't you stop him? And there was stunned silence as everybody looked around trying to find the person who said it. He said, who said that? Total silence as everybody looked around. And then Nikita Khrushchev smiled and said, that's why. The fear, palpable fear that was in the room, even at that being suggested, he says, now you know how we feel. Fear is real, isn't it? Fear makes you do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And I find it very, very interesting that now we're dealing with David, who has not operated as a fearful individual in the brief time that we've known him. Now, it doesn't mean that David's never been afraid. I mean, he was a shepherd dealing with wild animals that attacked his flock. He defeated those animals. He's defeated Goliath. It doesn't mean he's never been afraid. And let me assure you, before we kind of delve into this passage today, God does not shame people who are afraid. God doesn't think it's a terrible thing to be afraid, any more than he thinks it's terrible for you to be angry. But what does the Bible say about being angry? In your anger, do not sin. Same is true of fear, because fear, like anger, can dominate you as well. Then you're not doing things God's way, you're doing things your way. Whether it's out of anger or whether it's out of fear, it leads to the same place for a sinful human being who is not trusting God. We're going to see fear that is run amok in our hero David today. So he said goodbye to Jonathan. He has left the area as this tearful goodbye. Jonathan knows he's saying goodbye, possibly forever, as far as his dear friend David. And David is left. And he goes just a few miles. Actually, it's not more than 5 miles, as far as best I can determine, from where they were before to Nob, which is where Ahimelek the priest is. And that's where we pick up the story today in verse 1 of chapter 21. David went to Nob, to Ahimelek the priest, and Ahimelek trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is there no one with you?" This is an interesting question, because what it tells us, first of all, is that David is an important figure. He's recognizable. Because Ahimelek wasn't traveling, even though he was the priest, he isn't traveling in royal circles. He's not traveling with the movers and shakers in Israel. He's doing his priestly duty as he lives there with his family. And he is so frightened he's trembling. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that. I don't mean cold. I mean where you are so afraid you are literally shaking like a leaf. That's where Ahimelek is at. And for a couple of reasons. One is because David, this well-known guy, this commander, one of the main commanders of the Israelite army, he's wandering around by himself. That may not be reason for somebody to tremble, not knowing the intent of somebody, a famous person that you come across. But the message, or at least the story, has probably reached Ahimelek that Saul wants him dead. That will make you shake, I believe. My father, years ago, served in the National Guard, and at the time in the 1960s, during the Watts riots in Watts, California, down here, it was a particularly tumultuous time, a violent time. There were riots in the streets, and he was sent down there as long as his contingent. National Guardsmen were there with rifles trying to keep the rioters at bay. What they don't tell you in that story is that those National Guardsmen weren't armed. They had guns, but they weren't loaded, and they had no access to ammunition of any kind. So if they had to defend themselves, good luck. What they didn't want is the National Guardsmen getting fearful, trembling, and then shooting at the protesters. But it got much more than just mild protest. It got very violent down there with some of the people that were truly upset at the circumstances that were happening. But the National Guardsmen that were sent to keep order, not armed. So you think maybe they were a bit fearful of what was happening? I would have been. Ahimelek is worried. He's worried about being in the middle of a war zone. Saul is going to come to find David, and he's going to finish him off. And you don't have to be an expert in politics to know that Saul's a little, shall we say, off his rocker right now. He's not working with a full deck, this guy. And so he wants somebody dead. It's basically going to happen. So Ahimelek's nervous. Nothing wrong with him. Again, it's going to matter what we do in the middle of our fear. Verse 2, David answered, Ahimelek, the priest, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me in a certain place. Now then, what you have on hand, give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find. You know what? It's something that we do when we are fearful. We misrepresent. We lie. This is one of the mistakes we're going to see that David makes. He misrepresents himself. He lies. First of all, he lies to say that King Saul knows he's here and is endorsing his mission. Why David did this, we don't really know. He was certainly frightened of Saul. And maybe he's trying to set Ahimelek at ease because Ahimelek is shaken. He's trembling with fear. So perhaps it's a misguided idea at trying to settle down Ahimelek. The second thing he says is also a lie. He says, I have many men with me. Now that wasn't to make Ahimelek feel better. Probably it's to make himself feel better. I'm not alone. You can't hurt me. I got many men stashed. They're ready to rush to my defense. You try to do anything. Not that David was particularly afraid of what Ahimelek can do. But one of the mistakes that David makes out of his fear is he misrepresents himself. He lies. You know, it's interesting to me that he chooses to do this, because in order for David to lie, he has to accept a couple lies himself. And as we go into the text today, you're going to see these two lies have risen to the surface, even though David is a relatively faithful guy. He has been in his early years. He will be again. But of course, David will make some key mistakes too. Some real mistakes, some real moral choices, immoral choices, that he will make mistakes with. So he's misrepresenting himself. But the two lies he has to accept in order to behave this way is, number one, God's not in control. I don't know that David was not thinking this consciously, but this is what his actions say, right? If you ever confront a Christian and say, don't you believe that God's in control? They might say, of course I do, but yet their behavior speaks something else, doesn't it? Why? Because we're not focused on the fact that God is in control. We're focused on the fear that is generated by our set of circumstances. That's what David is doing. He is forgetting what he already knows. He's allowing how he feels to dictate the way he behaves. So obviously he has to accept this sort of fear that God may not be in control. Number two, what we're going to see is the lie that David is allowing himself to function in is that God won't provide for my needs. We're going to see that a little bit later. But first of all, God's not in control, and God can't supply my needs. Can't or won't, doesn't matter, I'm not going to get them, amen? So whether God can't do it, or whether he's not going to do it, still it's the same reality. I have to fend for myself. So first thing that happens, David misrepresents himself. Verse 3, now then, what you have on hand, give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find. But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. Now, it's not to say that women are especially sinful. What this means is sexual purity. Ahimelek is concerned about, because this bread is consecrated, it's set aside only for the priests. And so the priests should be, at least, keeping themselves pure. What Ahimelek wants some guarantees is these men that David has with him, he doesn't have them, by the way. These men that David supposedly has with him, that they've kept themselves sexually pure. Any kind of sexual activity outside of marriage, and this is not what a priest would do, thus they shouldn't be eating the consecrated bread. You might think, well, what does that matter? Understand the showbread on the show table. This is part of the tabernacle. You were with us during our Deuteronomy series. We were looking at the different places of the tabernacle. Remember the traveling temple. The temple isn't built in Israel until the time of Solomon. And so they still have the tent of meeting that they took through the desert with them. And it's in 3 different sections. It's the outer court, it's the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is where they keep the Ark of the Covenant. The holy place is where the show table is, where the show bread is. The show bread was supposed to show basically the provision of God. And every day that bread was replaced. And the old bread was given to the priests for them to eat. Remember, the priests were supplied their food, sacrificial meat, the bread from the show table. God took care of them because they were not foraging, they're taking care of priestly duties. So that bread, sacrificial meat, it goes to supply the food for Ahimelek and his family. So he says, credit to Ahimelek, right? He's willing to give up the bread. But he says, I want to make sure that you guys are appreciating this, not being appreciative to me, but being appreciative to God. Because this is consecrated bread. Don't be messing around with this. The Bible talks about something similar, guys. When we take communion one Sunday a month, God wants us not to do this unworthily. He doesn't mean any without sin in your heart. Otherwise, none of us would take communion, amen? But he said, don't do this unworthily. How can you take communion unworthily? One way is to not be a Christian. Why are you taking communion if you're not a Christian? Where does that make you? A liar. Don't take the cup. Ooh, juice, crackers. No. If you're not a Christian, that doesn't mean anything to you. You shouldn't be doing it. What's another way that you can take the communion unworthily? Well, you have your mind somewhere else. Where your mind is not on what you're doing. What is communion designed to do for us to remember? As Jesus told his disciples when he broke bread, the Last Supper, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." They didn't yet know what he was really talking about, but we do. As Christians, his body broken, the blood spilled, all for forgiveness of our sins. Remember this sacrifice. So we can have a religious ritual? No, because people are forgetful. And appreciation and thankfulness follows our remembering. So, Ahimelek says, don't be messing around here. This is consecrated bread. Make sure you have dedicated yourself to the Lord, or I'm not giving it to you. David says, oh, yeah, of course. It's all good. So what do you have on hand? This is the second part of what we described. David has misrepresented himself, and now David, because of the lies that he believes, now David believes that he must supply his own need. He's represented himself out of fear. Now, out of fear, he thinks he has to supply what he needs. Food. Remember, food is harder to come by than for us today. We just go down to the local store. We got, you can't throw a rock in Palmdale without hitting the grocery store. It's pretty easy for us to get food. But for David, not so much. So he's a little fearful about it. And because he doesn't think that God's totally in control, and because he's not sure that God's going to supply his needs, now he's trying to forage for himself. He's even going to the priest asking for consecrated bread. David knows better. And it isn't so much, guys, that he ate or he took of the consecrated bread. It's the fact that he felt he had to lie to attain. There's precedence. It actually belongs. God has given it to the priest. If the priest gives it up, what does God care? You gave that freely of your own volition to somebody else, somebody in need. God bless, that's awesome. That's a positive thing. You saw somebody in need and you gave up the consecrated bread. That's good. It's not that David was going to consume the consecrated bread. It's that he thought he had to deceive in order to get it. Right? So God's not going to supply my needs. I need to go and do it myself. Verse 5, David replied, "Indeed, women have been kept from us, or as usual, whenever I set out, the men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?" What he's basically saying is that we would keep ourselves holy when we're on holy missions. And we're on a holy mission right now. Even during a non-holy mission, we would have kept ourselves consecrated and holy. How much more so today, he says. Verse 6. So the bread there, so the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. So the replacement that happens every day, so the new bread is on the show table in the tabernacle. The old bread, the day-old bread, went home with the priest. He's at home. And he gives it up freely to David, because he's convinced that David needs it more than he and his family. Verse 7, now one of Saul's servants was there. Oh, pardon me, I went ahead. Here, verse 6, so the priest gave him the consecrated bread, and since there was no bread except the bread of the Lord, so it's taken away. Verse 7, now one of Saul's servants was there that day. He detained before the Lord. He was Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd. Now, to you and I, a chief shepherd in the kingdom sounds a little strange. What was he in charge of? Well, he's a person of importance in the ancient world. Yes, you had money, you had gold and silver and precious gems, but how did you really define you were wealthy? Flocks of animals. So someone who was the chief in charge of all of the different shepherds of the kingdom, imagine his authority. This is an important guy in Saul's kingdom. And he is an Edomite. He's the chief of the shepherds. He's here. It's going to be important to notice that, because in chapter 22, rather, we're going to find that Saul finds out where David is through Doeg. And actually, Saul will come with his men, and he will murder Ahimelek, all the priests, and all of Ahimelek's family, and slaughter the animals that they have. Out of what? His anger and his bitterness, his hatred. Because you have supplied need to my enemy. He's completely off the rails. So Doeg's an important figure that we're going to actually meet next chapter, verse 8. David asked Ahimelek, don't you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapons, because the king's mission was urgent. Now this must have sounded very odd to Ahimelek. This is one of the main commanders of the army. He's not armed. He didn't bring a sword. What is David asking for? Well, he knows exactly what he's asking for. The priest, verse 9, replied, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here, but that one," David said, "there is none like it. Give it to me." So you see there's a twofold breakdown here for David. Not only does he think he needs to supply his need as far as food, he needs to supply his need as far as protection. Is he not the ordained future king of Israel? Is he not anointed by the prophet of God that he would be king of Israel? You think this possibly would be an assurance of protection for David, but it's not. After all, what good is Goliath's sword to him? He's used it once to cut off the head of Goliath, and guess what? Goliath was already dead. Didn't do him any good, so he could hold up the head in victory. Goliath's sword has been no help to him. And now he wants Goliath's sword. When he faced Goliath before, he had a sling and 5 smooth stones. And he faced Goliath with bravery. Doesn't mean he had no fear, guys. I want you to understand that. Doesn't mean he had no fear facing Goliath. But his courage, his confidence in the Lord was greater than his fear of Goliath. Guess what now? His fear of Saul has overtaken him. Goliath didn't intimidate him the way that Saul is now. What's different for David? He's given into fear. Because that same confidence in the Lord would have stamped out his fear, and different choices would be made. What has David done? He has given into this idea that God is not in control and God will not supply my need. So I need Goliath's sword. I need that showbread. Give it to me. For I'm supplying my own need. You know, the Bible is very clear about God's love for us and clear about his provision for us. And he actually makes reference to the birds of the air and the animals in the field and how much they are taken care of. They're taken care of by the natural world, what naturally grows, natural processes that are there. Birds, animals don't need to invent anything. They don't need to grow anything. They live off of what is already here as part of the natural world created by God. And then the question is asked, because God cares for all of those, don't you think he'll care for you too? All the more for David, who is ordained by God to be the next king of Israel. And what amazing provision has already been made. It's clear that David is not yet ready to be king. Can you see that? His fear still dominates him. But the mercy of God, he will allow David to go through more training before he's ready to take leadership of the nation. His mercy shows too as well, because very clearly you and I might have made a different decision when it came to Saul some time ago. Let's just take this guy out. He is just trouble. He's getting worse. He's causing trouble for other people. He's going to kill Ahimelek and his family. I'm taking him out right now. You and I might have made that choice. But in his mercy, he allows Saul to still sit on the throne for a number of years, giving Saul a chance to profess faith once again in God and to be restored. But he won't. God knows he won't, and he still gives him the mercy of that decision. David misrepresented himself in fear. He has decided he needs to provide for himself in that fear. And then he goes to Gath. Look at verse 10. That day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Oh, wait a minute. Who is more hated in all the Philistine land than David, commander of the Israelite army? Saul is hated, but he's killed his thousands. David has killed his 10,000s. They're actually going to reference this phrase that is said among the ladies of Israel. I know where I'll go to avoid my enemy. I know where I'll go to avoid the person trying to kill me. I'll go to my enemies, the Philistines. David's not thinking straight. So now to the point, David has given into fear so much that he's not using his hand. David has lost himself. First he has misrepresented himself. Then he thinks he needs to provide for himself. Now he's lost himself. And he goes to Gath. What's interesting is not only does he go to Gath, land of the Philistines, one of the main cities of the Philistines, but also Gath is the hometown of Goliath. You think maybe they hold a little bit of a grudge? I think probably so. If you would have made a list of the top 5 worst places for him to go, this might be number 1. David's not even making intelligent choices now. His own self-interest has been affected by his fear. Verse 11, but the servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, king of the land? He's so hated, they've elevated him past Saul already. Here's king of our hated enemy, he says. They say. Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. There probably aren't words to describe how much they hated this man. And he says, I know how to avoid Saul. I'll go to the Philistines. You ever been so scared that you're just not making any good choices? Or you've convinced yourself that there is nothing but bad choices for you to make? That's where David is. Verse 12, David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. You know what? It arrives too late that David's made a poor choice. He's in Gath. He's facing King Achish in Gath, surrounded by Philistines. He's probably hearing what they're saying about him, and now he thinks, oh, I've made a dreadful mistake. You know, Samson made horrible mistakes all of his life. He was not a faithful man. But you know what? Hebrews chapter 11 lists Samson as a hero of the faith. You know why he does that? Because about the last 20 to 30 minutes of his life, he was completely faithful to the Lord. It's amazing what God sees through rose-colored glasses when he looks at you and me. He sees the faithful and he just dismisses the lack of faithfulness in our lives. So grateful. I'm so grateful. Imagine Samson getting a well done, good and faithful servant when he walked through the pearly gates. Really? Me? Cool. Samson was faithful at the end of his life where he said, I've blown it. I have walked away from you. In these last few moments, God, let my enemies know who you are. And his hair grew. And he pushed the pillars aside, and the temple of Dagon came down all around the Philistines, killing them all, and Samson as well. You might think that's not a happy story, Pastor. That's a faith versus fear, yes, because Samson knew it was the end of his life. And he said, let me finish my life in faithfulness, not in fear. Well, David is petrified at this moment, and his mistakes continue. Verse 13, so he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. I know what I'll do. I'll act crazy. We have that in our society too. It's called temporary insanity. People use it to get out of crimes all the time. Well, I was temporarily insane. I'm fine now. But for a moment, I lost my head. It's not my fault. David is faking. He's pretending. He's pretending to be a madman. Marks on the door, meaning he's destroying property and actually marking his territory. Ew, that's what he's doing. And as well, on top of that, he's just letting the drool come down all over the place, trying to look like he's foaming at the mouth. And I love this from Achish. Verse 14, Achish said to his servants, look at this man, he's insane. Why bring him to me? Achish basically says, do we have not enough madmen in Gath? Do I not have enough truly people who have lost their minds in this town alone? You bring another one to me? Achish is convinced this isn't David. This is some crazy guy. This is somebody who has taken leave of his senses. This is somebody who has truly lost touch with reality. And so it works. So you might say to me, Pastor Will, sounds like you're being a little harsh. This is effective. It works. Except that this is the same man, and we look at verse 15. Am I so short of man then that he must bring this fellow here to me to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house? So you might say, well, it worked for David. He's released. We find out he is. But this man who stood boldly before the giant Goliath, the man who stood absolutely without any fear at all, leading men of Israel, charging against the Philistines, defeating them at every turn, this man now, before a pagan king, pretends madness. David has lost himself. And guys, I will tell you something about lying, misrepresenting yourselves, pretending, relying upon yourself. The fact of the matter is, we may get out of the immediate circumstance of difficulty, but let me tell you something. When you lie, when you deceive, you know what happens? You actually create problems for yourself down the road. Happens every time. And so you might solve what's in front of you, but you've created another hurdle for yourself down the road. For the rest of his life, David will pay the price for his mistakes with Bathsheba. But you know what? This man who fails so completely in this moment, he is also the man through his mistakes, produces a son named Solomon. And King Solomon, because he was wise in the wisdom of God, says these words. And Solomon made plenty of mistakes too. But a man raised by David says these words, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths, tell me, church, straight. This is the son of David who says these words, who writes these words in Proverbs chapter 3. David didn't stay fearful, praise the Lord. You and I need to avoid giving in to fear. And again, courage is not the absence of fear, amen? Courage is doing the right thing. And in this case, for the believer in Christ, courage is doing things God's way. Instead of relying upon the showbread, relying upon the sword of Gath that was the sword of Goliath that was worthless for him, instead doing things God's way would have worked out far better for him. He learns that lesson and becomes a different king as a result. Even teaching his son, just trust the Lord rather than fear your circumstances and work on it.